In today's lesson, we're going to look at how to create a major scale. Now, there are 12 major scales in our Western system. So if you can learn how to create a major scale, then all we have to do is start it on a separate pitch or a different pitch, and we'll be able to create all 12 major scales. Now, the other most common type of a scale is a minor scale, and we'll talk about those scales in a different video. So right now we're going to focus on our major scales. So the first scale that we like to talk about in our major scale series is a scale called C major. Now, the reason we like C major is because it uses all of the white keys, and therefore it's a little bit easier to see. Now, each major scale is going to be made up of a total of 7 notes, and oftentimes we'll write them out in a total of 8 notes, but the first and the last note is actually the same note. So there's really only 7 different notes, even though we're going to write it out with a total of 8 notes. So in a few videos previously, we looked at how to find our C. So remember, we take a group of 2, and we go to the left, and that's where we're going to find our C. And so our collection of major scales is really based on the difference between whole and half steps, or sometimes we call them whole steps and semitones. So between the C and the next note, which is D, we're going to have a whole step. Because remember, in order to have a whole step, you have to have 2 half steps or 2 semitones. And then between the D and the E, we have another whole step. Now between the E and the F, we have our half step or our semitone, put an S there for short. And then we have another whole tone between F and G. Between G and A, we have another whole step. Between A and B, we have a whole step. And then we have our final semitone at the end. So if we look at the pattern, we see whole, whole, semitone, whole, 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 semitone. Oftentimes, what teachers like to do is break up a scale into what's known as a tetrachord. Tetrachord is just a fancy word for 4, tetra meaning 4. So if you look at a tetrachord, our first tetrachord is C, D, E, and F. And in between, we have a whole, whole, and then a half step or a semitone. And then our next tetrachord is G, A, B, C, which is the same pattern actually of whole, whole, half. So if you were to cut a scale right in half, we would have a whole, whole, half step or semitone, and then a whole, whole, half step. Now this is separated by a whole step, which is why our pattern of a major scale is whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, or whole, whole, semitone, whole, 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 semitone. So if you can memorize this pattern, then when it comes to writing any of the scales, all you have to do is start with whichever note you'd like, and you can create a scale. Let's look at the major scale on the staff. So for our purpose, we're going to use C major again. Let's use this lower note on the staff. So let's use that low C right there. And then the next step above that would be a D, which is there on that line. And then we have an E, followed by our F, and then our G, our A, B, and finally, our last C. So even if we look at the staff, we still have the pattern of a whole step, half tone or semitone. And it's followed by another tetrachord that's separated by a whole step. And then we have whole, whole, and then a half or a semitone. So if you memorize this pattern, then all of your major scales will be really easy and really simple to work with. In fact, they're all going to be exactly the same. Now in C major, I really enjoy working in this key because one, it's easy to see, but also if we look at this next chart, you can see that there is the relative minor of A minor right below. So when we talk about scales that are relevant or related, our A minor is going to be related to our C major scale. And again, we'll talk about minors in a later video. And also we'll talk about how to modulate or how to go from one key, like C major, one scale, to the next scale really smoothly. Now, this is part of what's called the circle of fifths, and we'll tackle that in a new video. But the idea here is that all of the colored notes in the chart are going to be closely related keys. So if you were playing from a C or writing a piece from a C, and you wanted to go to a G, or you wanted to go to an F, all of these colored notes are interconnected on some level. So let's look at how we would see our major scale again on the keyboard. Now, if we look at this chart, one of the things you'll notice is that we call C, or the first note of the scale, the tonic. And that's going to be a really big point to drive home. No matter what the starting note is, it's always going to be called tonic. So if we start on a D and we create a D major scale, then the D is going to be called tonic. If we start on a G, then the G is going to be called the tonic. Now, as you can see from this chart here, we also can start on any of the scale degrees using the same scale, and we'd actually call it a different scale. So for example, these are what we call church modes, by the way. But if we start on the first note of the C major scale and play from C to C, we would call it our Ionian or our major scale. If we started on our second note of the scale, and again, we're not changing any of the notes, so we would just play D, and then we'd play E, F, G, A, B, C, and then we'd go all the way up to D again. That would be called our Dorian, and it has a slightly different sound because we want to focus on D. Now, if we were to start on the third note of the scale, we would call that Phrygian. And the fourth note of the scale would be called Lydian. Then the fifth note, we call that Mixolydian. And then the sixth note, which is actually how our minor scale works, where our minor scale starts, that's called Aeolian. And then finally, if we were to start the scale on the seventh note, it would be called Locrian. So we can create different types of scales, different modes, by actually writing a piece that starts and ends on any of these scale degrees. But for the most part, right now, we want to focus on the major scale, which is from C to C in this context. Now, let's look at it on the staff. This is how it would be written on the staff with the same idea. So if you have a C major scale, we're going to start on C, which is right here in the middle. And typically we want to end on C when we're writing it out. Now, for a C major scale, it doesn't have to be in the bass clef or the treble clef. It can actually be in both, or it can be transposed up or down. In fact, on most pianos, there are 8 places that you can actually play a C major scale. So don't let that confuse you. It doesn't necessarily have to start on this C up here, and it doesn't have to start down on that C. It can really start on any C and go up the scale. One of the things we'll talk about in a later video is the actual names of the notes from different scale degrees. So for example, we already talked about the first note being tonic. Well, our next most important note is called the dominant, and that's the 5th scale degree in any of our scales. Now, because if you count 5 notes up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we get a dominant. By counting 5 notes down, 2, 3, 4, 5, this is our F, we get what's called our subdominant, which is actually here as well. So if we go 5 up, we get our dominant. If we go 5 below, we get our subdominant. Now, to make it easy, we oftentimes will just put it 4 notes up to show that it's within the range of our normal scale. Those are going to be the main notes that almost all music is created off of. In fact, when we look at chords, triads, harmonies, and things like that, most chords and most pieces are actually created using what's called the 1, the 4, and the 5, or the 1st scale degree, the 4th scale degree, and the 5th scale degree. Now, of course, the other scale degrees are important, but there's typically a hierarchy in Western music, and we used to call tonic our home key, because that's kind of the place where we want to rest the most, and dominant is where we would consider it being as far away as possible. Now, everything leads either to the dominant or to tonic. So when we're talking a little bit about the subdominant typically leads to the dominant. Sometimes, and in some contexts, the subdominant can lead back to the tonic. I think of particularly hymns, old church music from the 1700s and 1800s. Oftentimes the last bar would be an amen or a 4 to a 1 progression, and that was kind of a normal way to get back to 1 is to have a 4 over 1. That was kind of thought of as like a common progression in the 1800s. But throughout most of history, 5 typically leads back to 1. So we want to try to get to 5 before we go back to 1 in most of our functional harmony. And of course, all of the 7 different notes of our scale can lead to different places. So if we were to look at this chart I have over here for us, here's our 1 chord, or our tonic chord. And for now, if we think about it, it can actually go anywhere. So if you're creating a piece of music, from 1, you can go anywhere. And that means anywhere in this chart. So let's just say we're going to go as far away as we possibly can. So from 1, we're going to follow and go all the way over to 3. So then from 3, if we follow our chart here, we have 2 options. We can either go to the 6, or we can go to the 4, just depending on what we want to do. So let's just say our chord progression is going to be a 1, going to a 3, and then just for kicks and giggles, let's go to a 4. That'll be our next chord. And then from our 4, we can decide to either go back to 6 to elongate our chord progression, or we can go to our 5 chord. And again, our goal is to get to 5. So why don't we just, for time's sake, why don't we get to our 5 a little bit quicker? And then from 5, boom, we can get back to 1. And it's kind of like a game board if you use this like that, so that you can see the different chord progressions that are possible and most common in Western music. So the chord progression we used is 1, 3, 4, 5, and 1, which is right down here, the bottom half of your screen. And in fact, all of these chord progressions are possible. Some are more common than other, but the idea is to find chord progressions that work for you. And you can tell that they don't all end on 1, so sometimes they end on 5. Like if we look at this chord progression, 1, 4, 5, we can end on 5, or we can go 1, 4, 6, 5. But typically these chord progressions loop, so even if you see a chord progression like 1, 4, 5, generally it's not just those 3 chords, but it loops over and over again, 1, 4, 5, 1, 4, 5, 1, 4, 5. So that's just a general overview of our C major scale. I hope that was helpful. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Thanks for watching.